to Williamsburg, sending the others with the horses and most of the supplies to follow. They returned through Wills Creek, Frederickstown, and eventually to Williamsburg, where Washington reported the French rejection of the governor's demands. In questioning his young emissary, the governor noted how precisely Washington recalled the French commander's exact words. Washington produced his journal, and when Dinwiddie realized that Washington had so well captured the haughty, dismissive tone of the French, and interpreting that as a slight to the English king, the governor had the journal printed up and distributed to the House of Burgesses, and later abroad to Great Britain, using it to generate support for fiscal appropriation and the authority for military action to drive the French out. Dinwiddie then asked his young major to head up a punitive expedition to rid the British colonies of the French. Washington, perhaps for the first time assessing reality, agreed to serve the colony however he might, but that as he had no military training or experience, it would be wise to choose a more experienced leader. Dinwiddie chose Joshua Fry, a scholar and old soldier, made him colonel of the expedition, and made Washington second in command, promoting him to lieutenant colonel. In the interim, while all this travel and discussion continued on the east, the Ohio Company had sent a team of carpenters and woodsmen to the forks of the Ohio, responding to Washington's report on the value of that location. They were to build a fortified trading post, establish a solid base of trade, and draw the Indians away from French influence. Receiving intelligence of this bold move, the French sent a large contingent of soldiers and Indians who drove out the smaller British presence, took over their fledgling efforts, and turned the structure into Fort Duquesne. That fort became the command center for the central region. So for Fry and Washington's punitive expedition, Fort Duquesne was now the objective. Colonel Fry, leading the British militia force, set out from Williamsburg in the spring of 1754, marching north through Fredericktown, northwest across Hampshire County, on to Wills Creek, pressing toward Fort Duquesne. The governor wanted quick movement, but the force was incomplete, all recruits necessary not raised. En route, Fry ordered Washington to take a force of some 300 men and with Gist's guidance proceed to Great Meadows, make camp, and await the remainder of his forces, while preparing for assault on the French farther west. Fry would hold at Wills Creek, establish his logistics base, and await arrival of the remainder of the troops he'd been promised, as well as fresh horses and further supplies to supplement their current meager lot. Washington, marching his troops west and north, reaching Great Meadows, looking out over the muddy, unlikely ground, made his most naive and unfortunate comment. "This is a charming field for an encounter." He set his men to work laying out their tent ranks in a gap between two small gullies. His lack of military experience is evident in his selection of what was possibly the worst site ever chosen for troops to defend. The ground, mostly in a depression, was surrounded by rising slopes, large boulders, and trees. Excellent cover for an assaulting enemy force. It was late spring, and heavy rains had made the ground into a bog. Work was difficult. Washington was advised by courier that French forces were on the march with no good intent for the Brits. Within 3 days of reaching Great Meadows, Tanaquarison, the half-king, sent word of imminent danger. Shortly, an Indian runner arrived, who brought word that he had discovered an armed body of French camped in a small glen not far away. They were likely those whom the half-king had warned were on their way to attack Washington. The young officer, determined to avoid ambush, chose to advance to meet the French. With some 40 men, they marched through a cold, extremely dark, rainy night, following the Indian scout, accompanied now by Tanaquarison and a few other Indians, to the site of the French camp. It was only 6 miles from Great Meadows.